Well, welcome back, everyone, to the video 4 of Saylor Academy's live series, Bitcoin for Everybody. Just a reminder, this is a companion series to Saylor.org's Bitcoin course, which you can find at learn.saylor.org/PRDV151. I'll make sure that all of that is in the descriptions and in the comments. And I'll also make sure that I put it in the chat along with the discourse discussion forums, so that you guys can keep this conversation going amongst yourselves. So we have a good show lined up for you. Obviously, Stephan Livera is with us as always, hosting, and we have Jimmy Song, who is a Bitcoin developer, educator, and entrepreneur, and the CEO of MicroStrategy and the trustee of the Saylor Academy, technically my boss, Michael Saylor. So with that, Stephen, if you want to take it away.
Thank you very much, Michael. So welcome back, listeners and viewers. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the basics of Bitcoin's technology, and Jimmy and Michael are going to help us by teaching us a little bit about that and maybe providing a little bit of commentary in and around these ideas as well. So maybe if we just start, So for those of you, if you go through the material, we've got a few videos and a few podcasts and a few articles that explain a little bit around how Bitcoin works under the hood. And so I guess today we might just talk through some of that, and I'll try to ask some of the questions that maybe a new person might have. And I'll also keep an eye on the chat as well. So if you have questions in the chat, you can make sure to ask them there. But perhaps we could start with you, Jimmy. Can you give us just like some overview? How does Bitcoin work? If I, let's say I send a transaction to you, what does that look like on the Bitcoin network?
Yeah, a transaction is basically a bunch of bytes, and it has some information about it. The money that you are spending, this is what we would call the transaction inputs, and then where you are sending the money, the places that you are sending it to. So these are the transaction outputs. You can think of each of these outputs as sort of like a mailbox for a particular person. And when you send money to them, anyone can send money into that mailbox, but only the person with the private key can unlock them and do something with them. And that's how Bitcoin works. It's it's based on some public key cryptography. Essentially, anyone can send to your public key or a hash of the public key, as it were, but only the person with the private key can actually spend it. So that would be the analogy that I would use.
Excellent. And so it's like it can be a tricky thing when you're first coming into this, because you might not have a good analogy to think of it. Like you might just be thinking, oh, my normal bank account, I just send $50 from here to this other person. But in Bitcoin land, it's very different. Think of it like there's no pull system. It's a push system in Bitcoin land. And so in Bitcoin land, you can think of it like, as Jimmy was saying, it's like there's this ledger up in the sky or in the cloud, if you will, and it shows transactions from A to B, but we don't necessarily know who is behind those transactions. And so it's what you're doing is you are essentially, your Bitcoin wallet or your Bitcoin software is, in some sense, it's signing a message to say, I want to send 0.1 Bitcoin from this address to this place on the ledger. And one way to think of that is the network is, in some sense, saying, yes, this is a valid transaction, or no, that's not a valid transaction. We do not recognize that. And so that's a little bit of the interplay there. And so perhaps if we could just talk a little bit about how that network works and that ledger. So perhaps, Jimmy, if you could just give like an overview, what is that?
Yeah, so the ledger in Bitcoin is called the blockchain, but it's and you can think of each block as a page in the ledger, and it's a new page is added essentially every 10 minutes, and it has a list of transactions or a group of transactions that get added, and these are new transactions in the ledger. And anyone that is running a full node implementation or the Bitcoin software validates that page is consistent with the other pages of the ledger, and that it's consistent with itself. So it isn't, for example, spending the same output twice, something like that. And everyone that's running this software needs to get the data from some other nodes on the network, and this is done through network programming. Typical, you know. Transfer involves stuff like transactions and blocks and things like that. And usually like blocks propagate in a few seconds, so do transactions, but the entire network knows about it very, very quickly. But as you receive it, you're not just saying, oh, this must be good. You verify it yourself. The software verifies everything on to make sure that it follows all of the rules, including, is it trying to double spend? Is it creating money out of thin air? Is it are all the signatures valid? Is it doing anything that it shouldn't be doing? If it doesn't meet all of the rules, then the software will simply reject that block and refuse to add it to the ledger. So each page is validated by the software on a continuous basis as new blocks come in, as are transactions, in case you want to know, hey, I just received the payment, but it isn't in the ledger yet. Once a block is found, then it goes into the ledger, and that's how that works.
Excellent. Michael, let's bring you in here as well. So maybe if you could give any thoughts that, what are some things that a person who is new to Bitcoin, what are some things that they might be getting wrong in their sort of mental model of how Bitcoin is working, because they're comparing it to the fiat world? Do you have any kind of analogies or any useful kind of things for them to think about?
I think most people are still always used to an instantaneous response from a single server with a degree of fragility. Like I try to do something and I immediately get either a green check, or half the time I get rejected by the bank. You're not supposed to do that thing. And there's that sense of central authority and confirmation. And I think with the Bitcoin network, because it's so decentralized and fault tolerant, you do something, you don't get the immediate response. The good news is no one's going to give you a red mark and say you can't do it. The bad news is you have to be patient and wait 32 minutes for 3 confirmations to go through. And there is a degree of, the price we pay for this like post-apocalyptic mission critical fault tolerance is that maybe 6 confirmations is better than 3 confirmations. And the wallet that you use or the software that you use may give you different feedback and may have different degrees of confirmation they require. So I think that a person that's not comfortable with Bitcoin, they're just used to a pass, fail, break, not break, instant thing. And when you get used to Bitcoin, you realize that there's an entire, quantum spectrum of like how confirmed something is. And it's a good thing, but you have to get used to a new paradigm.
Yeah, that's a great point to make there, Michael. And I think maybe Jimmy, if we could get you to help explain. So Michael was talking about this concept of confirmations and how having more confirmations means you are more secure. So Jimmy, if you could just touch on what is a confirmation and why is it that having more makes it more secure?
Yeah, so the word blockchain comes from the fact that we have a linked list of blocks. It's each block is built on top of another. That's one way to think of it. And in order to, and at any point, there may come across, a group of blocks that are equally valid. That might be longer than the current set of blocks that you have in your ledger. And in that case, you're supposed to take the longer one. That's how the software is designed. Now, the idea of a confirmation gets into mining, and I think we will wait a little bit on explaining exactly what mining is. But suffice it to say that each block requires a significant amount of energy in order to get. So your transactions in that block are secured by the energy spent for what's called the proof of work, the mining aspect of Bitcoin. And if you have 3, you have 3 times as much security around the transaction that you did as blocks are built on top of one another, you can imagine that if you pulled the third block down, that you're essentially toppling the other two on top of it. So that's how it's secured. It's 3 times as much security for 3 confirmations as it is 1 confirmation. But yeah, that level of security around your transaction is an important concept that Michael pointed out.
Yeah. And also, I think it might be useful as well just to contrast Bitcoin's security versus other things. So typical examples would be Bitcoin against other fiat monies and Bitcoin against gold. And so what are the kinds of security levels that we're thinking of when we're thinking about Bitcoin? Perhaps, Michael, if you could comment around some of the, I guess, the ways that when we use these different techniques or different options, how do we think about the security and the settlement, like what someone like Nick Carter might call the settlement assurances of these 3 contrasting options?
Gold, fiat, Bitcoin. Well, I guess with fiat, you have the appearance of instant settlement, but the substance of not having instant settlement. So you have a paradox there where you think something happened, but in point of fact, perhaps the final settlement hasn't happened for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 7 days, and with some things like with bank wire transfers, it could be as much as 30 days. I've seen. So with the matter of transaction verification and securities is a tricky one. It's hard to know that you've actually moved the money. And I guess the other part of security with regard to fiat is if you have money in a bank, how secure is the money in the bank? And you've built up this layer of assumptions like, I only lost money in 2 banks in the world. I lost money in an Argentine bank, and I lost money. Let me rephrase it. I only lost money overnight in 2 banks in the world. I lost money slowly, right? In every bank that I ever put money into. If you put money in a bank, you're losing 1% a month or 1% every quarter everywhere in the world. But I did once wake up and lose all my money in 2 banks. And the first example of lack of security was an Argentine bank where I had $1 million in the bank, and it was in dollars. And in the morning, the government passed a law converting it to pesos at $1 to a peso. And in the afternoon, the government devalued the peso to 10 pesos to the dollar. And the next day, I had 1/10 of what I'd had the previous day. And so that illustrates the risk of a political risk in a bank, right? And I guess the other example is in Brazil. I once lost $1 million or $2 million in Brazil. And that was an example where the CEO of the bank stole the money or made a bunch of insolvent loans, bankrupted the bank through accounting fraud, and the bank got decapitalized. And I ended up standing behind all the other creditors. We never got the money back. So I guess with fiat, right, you've got political risk, you've got execution risk and company or banking risk. With regard to gold, I mean, the security issue is, assuming you're owning the physical gold, you're putting it in a vault. I mean, maybe a vault in New York City or a vault in London. And I guess then you have the banking risk. The bank might actually lose the gold, and then you have the political risk, and you have another type of multiple political risk, right? The risk the gold gets seized, or the risk that the gold gets taxed in the local jurisdiction. I think with regard to Bitcoin, the really nice thing about Bitcoin is you manage to take out so many layers of risk in this. You take out the political layer, you take out the corporate layer of risk. And because you take out so much complexity, then you've got fewer things to fail. And I guess the other thing you do is you take out the political attack surface. I think Bitcoin is like more secure because you can move $1 million of it from New York to Malta in an hour. And you can move it from one custodian to another, or you can personally custody it, or you can multi-sig it, like 3 people. So you don't have the option to simultaneously hold $1 million of gold with your cousin in Malta and yourself. So you don't have those options with physical things. You don't really have those options with fiat, but with Bitcoin, you have a lot of these security options, and I think that means you get functionality, but also I think that the lack of the political attack surface means that I can pass a law in New York City taxing gold because I know it's there. I know it's hard to move the gold, but there's no point in passing a law in New York City taxing Bitcoin. My point, of course, is if the tax is 100%, that's the risk, right? You lost it all. But I wouldn't really bother with regulation that might actually devalue the asset if I thought that it was impossible for the regulation to be successful. And so I think with Bitcoin, you protect yourself from the corporate risk because you don't have to trust a company. If you do trust a company, you've got 1,000 other companies, and they're all competing with each other to earn your trust. And as soon as if you were to lose that trust, all the Bitcoin would leave within 48 hours. So you've just got a much better degree of security from any corporation you would ever trust. You don't have to. And then you've just got a lot less political risk because it's the most mobile property on the earth.
Yeah, that's a really excellent explanation. And one way to think of it is that Bitcoin provides us assurances that the fiat banking world simply cannot provide us. And Bitcoin gives us these possibilities that unfortunately are not possible with physical gold. And so these are some of the ways to think about Bitcoin as something different from what we currently use today, or what most people are currently using today. So listeners, don't forget, you can ask questions in the chat. Obviously, try to keep them focused on the technicals aspect of Bitcoin. That's the theme for today. And we might also now touch on some Bitcoin mining. So perhaps, Jimmy, if you could give us just a high-level overview. What is Bitcoin mining, and just the high-level overview on how that works?
Yeah, so Bitcoin mining is a lot like physical gold mining. I'm told that for a gold miner, what they have to do is process somewhere around 40 tons of dirt and rock in order to find 1 ounce of gold. And Bitcoin, it's similar, except it's done in the digital realm instead of the physical realm. So instead of processing dirt and rock, you have to process lots and lots of different numbers. And each number, it has the possibility of being that ounce of gold, but it's actually very, very rare, and it's attached essentially to each of these pages in the ledger. So as you create the page, one of the things that you do is you look for this particular input that will get you the right output, which we call proof of work. And it is just as rare as, it's far more rare than gold is in the physical earth. And it takes a lot of computing power to go through it. And that process of doing it is called mining in Bitcoin. And it requires a lot of electricity instead of, chemicals and, people that process this stuff in the physical gold world. Like finding gold, it is very difficult, but once you've found gold, it is relatively easy to verify that it is gold. So it has this asymmetry. You can you could put the gold onto a touchstone to check that it is gold. You can do different chemical tests and so on. It's fairly easy to verify. Whereas and it's similar for proof of work. Once you've found it, it takes oodles of energy to go find it. But any cell phone or computer can very easily verify, because you put the input into the what we call the hash function, and you get the expected output, and you can verify it very easily. So it's an asymmetric function, and each page in the ledger needs a proof of work in order to be inserted into the ledger. This is one of the rules by which Bitcoin runs. So if you try to give a new page in the ledger that doesn't have proof of work in it, that doesn't have this gold nugget essentially attached to it, then it is rejected by the rest of the network. And that is proof essentially that a certain amount of energy has been spent in order to find this particular that gives the miner the right to insert this page into the ledger, and that enables them to get 6.25 Bitcoins currently in block subsidy, as well as the fees that were in the transactions themselves.
Excellent. And so it's, Bitcoins are being mined over time. On average, 10 minutes that's when a new block is found. Obviously, it can be more, can be less. And that then also moves alongside with the difficulty adjustment and so on. But I guess just to keep it high level, we can think of it like mining is kind of like this decentralized lottery. And so when you are contributing hash power, as Jimmy was pointing out, SHA-256 hashing, and now you need specialized equipment to do this nowadays. That's called application specific integrated circuit. So that's called ASIC. And so basically Bitcoin miners go and set up an operation where they run many of these ASICs, and then they contribute hash power to the network. And then depending on how much hash power they're contributing, that's their probability of winning the next block. And so I guess those are some of the ways to think about that. Now, I guess some of the common questions that people might have are around the energy mix, right? So there might be, how much of, renewable versus, or how much of wind and solar and, gas and hydro or coal power. So I think that's an open question. We don't, there's obviously research around that. So currently there's actually a fair amount of renewable energy that is going into Bitcoin mining, but we don't know exactly, where that would go. But if either of you would like to offer any comments around the energy going into Bitcoin mining, and whether you've got any thoughts on where you think that's going.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few. Just with regard to energy consumption, what we know that the average price of commercial energy is like 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and for consumer residential energy about 13 cents a kilowatt hour. And the Bitcoin network runs on profitably around 2 cents, or it has been running 2 cents a kilowatt hour. There's this massive search worldwide for the cheapest possible energy. So the competition of Bitcoin mining, I think, is driving all of the miners to the edge of the power grid. The ideal energy source is going to be energy that has no commercial usage and has no residential usage, because otherwise they would bid up the price of the energy. And then energy that is going to come from one of two places. Either it's like super cheap renewable energy because you've got a waterfall or a geothermal source and there's no other use for it, or it's stranded capital that's been abandoned, a plant that would otherwise be shuttered and the capital would be destroyed, and this is the marginal best use for the economy. So the nature of Bitcoin mining economics is to drive a very entrepreneurial quest to recycle marginal energy at the periphery of the world grid in such a way that it will naturally move Bitcoin mining away from population centers, where it'll move it away from dirty power near population centers, because that's going to be not only the most expensive energy, it's also the most politically unpalatable. Like, you can imagine if you set up a coal power plant in the middle of Manhattan, that's probably going to be the one that's going to be least popular politically and going to be the most expensive. And it's going to naturally gravitate toward the least politically controversial energy sources that are most renewable, that are least bid on by anybody else, that have the lowest variable cost. And there's a certain economic beauty to that.
Yeah, that's a really great explanation on the energy market dynamics. Might also be a good point just to talk a little bit about Bitcoin miner compensation. So perhaps, Jimmy, if you could tell us a little bit, how are Bitcoin miners compensated for their work?
Yeah, so each block, when they find the proof of work, each miner gets what's called a block subsidy. And this is based on the schedule that was in the original software code, actually. But currently, it is 6.25 Bitcoins per block. In the first era, the first 4 years, roughly 210,000 blocks, it was 50 Bitcoins per block. And that was every 10 minutes for the first 210,000 blocks, it was 50. Next 210,000 blocks, it was 25. Next 210,000 blocks, it was 12 and a half. So 50 plus 25 plus 12 and a half. Currently, it's at 6.25. If you can do the, converging series, that ends up being 100. 100 times 210,000 is 2.21 million. That's where we get the 21 million limit for Bitcoin comes from.
I thought it was
But yeah, that's right. It's on your shirt
my
there.
T-shirt.
Yeah. So that's how we get 21 million Bitcoins, because it asymptotically goes to 21 million as a result of it having every 210,000 blocks. But in addition to that, miners also get all of the fees that are in each transaction. So when you send a transaction, in order to incentivize the miner to include it in the ledger, each person that creates the transaction includes a fee. And this could be lower or higher depending on the current state of the network and how many other transactions are trying to get into the ledger at the same time. This is the fee that the miner gets to take. So just to give you a rough idea, currently there's a 6.25 block subsidy and about a 0.75 fee revenue that each block gets. So miners are currently getting somewhere around 12% of their revenue from fees. Now, as we have more and more, this will change a little bit. So after the next halving, we'll have each miner will be making 3.125, and if it goes up to say 1 Bitcoin per block in terms of fees, then they'll be getting somewhere around 23% of their revenue through fees, and the halving after that, it'll be closer to 40% and so on. Depending on where fees go, that'll be the case. One way to think about that I really like is from Lynn Alden, who described the security of the network as being secured by these two things, the block subsidy and the fees. So if you think about it, the block subsidy ultimately comes from the holders because it is expanding the supply of Bitcoin. Just like inflation in a fiat economy is a stealth way of taxing everyone. This, at least with this, it's explicit. So the holders are paying for about 88% of the security right now, and 12% is of the security is being paid by the people that are actually doing the transacting. This shifts more and more as we have more halvings. So one of the more common questions that people ask is, well, what happens when there's no block subsidy? Well, I would basically tell them, well, at that point, then the people that really should be paying are the ones paying instead of being subsidized by all of the holders of Bitcoin. They're getting instead subsidized. They're not subsidized at all, but they actually have to pay the miners for the security that they are receiving for their transactions.
Excellent. And we got a just question from the chat. They were asking, has the halving already happened? So there was, the most recent halving was last year. I think it was April or May 2020. Now there have been 3 halvings so far in Bitcoin's history, and there'll be, every 4 years, there'll be another one. So that's just a high level there. And might also be a good point to also talk a little bit about some of the attacks that people bring up in the mining world. So, I think the most common one people talk about is the 51% attack. So perhaps, Jimmy, if you could just give an overview, what is a 51% attack? And then what are some of the defenses that the Bitcoin network in essence has against some of these potential attacks?
Yeah, so the 51% attack is where one entity controls over 50% of the mining hash rate on the network. So that means that, among other things, they can reject the other blocks found by the rest of the network and always have sort of a longer chain than everybody else. Again, a chain, and the chain of blocks is always built on top of each other. So whichever is longer is supposed to be taken by the software. It's based on the accumulated proof of work or the accumulated difficult problem that that consumes energy that is in each block. So if we were to have a 51% attack, there are several varieties, but the main one that people talk about is the double spending attack. You could, for example, deposit a large amount of Bitcoin to an exchange, say, trade all of that for fiat money, withdraw that fiat money, and then after that withdrawal has happened, reorganize or introduce a new set of blocks that are longer than the current set of pages in the ledger. Essentially, it's a longer ledger that has instead of paying the exchange, pays to yourself. In which case, you would be able to keep the Bitcoin and get the cash that you traded it for. So that's one attack that could possibly happen. The other ones are something like the empty block attack, where they would just deny sending any transactions, and it would essentially be a way for whoever is controlling that 51% to deny any transactions from coming into the network. Now, there are mitigations for this. I've written entire articles on how that would work. But essentially, if there was sort of a centralized entity that controlled more than 50% of the network, the rest of the network would be highly motivated to create a decentralized consensus around something else. Because if it was centrally controlled, that's obviously bad, especially if they're attacking the network. And it doesn't have to be. If they're not attacking the network, then they would just be another member of the Federation of Miners, basically. But if they were attacking the network, then there would be motivation for the rest of the network to come to some sort of consensus, decentralized consensus, and go from there. And that's basically what I wrote in the article. If you are interested, it's on jimmysong.medium.com, debunking the empty block attack.
Excellent. Michael, any comments to add just around the Bitcoin network and how it, in some sense, either incentivizes people to help the network, or it sort of adapts in response to different attacks?
Sure. I think that mining dynamics are pretty fascinating here, and the entire way that the protocol evolves is just genius. Today, following this last halving, about 900 Bitcoin get mined every day, and that makes it at the current market price about $45 million a day in revenue, or about $18 billion a year. And it's $18 billion of mining revenue against about a $1 trillion monetary asset sitting on the network. So call it almost 2%. It's only less than 180 basis points or so. But of that, as Jimmy points out, maybe only 2 billion of it is the transaction fee. And that's like less than 20 basis points. So you have this large subsidy, this mining subsidy early on. In the first 25 years of the network, we're bootstrapping the build out of the entire Bitcoin security network with these block subsidies. And by the year 2035 or so, 99% of the Bitcoin is out there. So the last 1% comes over the next 100 years. And so you could see this as a sprint in the first 24 years. And right now, it's obscenely lucrative to set up a miner. So I think a couple of things. First of all, the network itself, the mining process, unlike gold mining is a bunch of effort to find gold. Bitcoin mining is a bunch of effort to find Bitcoin, plus to provide security, plus to process transactions. So the Bitcoin network's doing three things right now. The gold mining network does one thing. Now, the beauty is, if we could get everybody in the gold industry to agree to stop mining gold and cryptographically stamp their bars of gold, then we could cut, $100 billion a year worth of gold mining to zero and keep the existing gold bars, and their price would go up through the roof, right? I mean, you could imagine, because you're not wasting energy looking for additional gold to inflate the supply of gold. With Bitcoin mining, what you've got is a protocol that automatically does that for you. The new blocks go away. The transaction fees become all that there is to run the network, and that means that the holders don't get diluted. In theory, the transaction fees then have to grow, but the assets under management on the network will go up by a factor of 10 to 100. So when the Bitcoin network is 10 trillion, 20 basis points will be the same $20 billion. But the difference will be, right now, we're giving a massive subsidy to any entrepreneur in the world to develop really good SHA-256 ASICs. And so you see that what we've created is a massive global competition in technology to provide Bitcoin security. And it has specialized into ASICs, and it will increasingly specialize down one dimension. And that's really great for the security of the network, because that means that whoever wants to attack the network in the year 2035 is going to have to marshal not just a lot of money and not just a lot of electricity, but they're going to have to marshal a lot of the right hash power. And that hash power will be like 8 generations of computing technology ahead of where we are right now, and it'll be very decentralized. The second part of this is because Bitcoin mining, it's truly global, permissionless. No one has to ask permission to do it. What that means is that you have a monetary force to spread decentralization of the Bitcoin protocol to the ends of the earth without, and how is it decentralizing? It's decentralizing to the jurisdiction with the cheapest energy and with the most supportive political regime. So contrast this to if I had $1 trillion of gold sitting in a vault in New York City. Okay, where's the security coming from for $1 trillion of gold in a vault in New York City? It's not coming from Iceland. It's not coming from China. It's not coming from the North Pole. It's coming from the security guards at the bank in New York City. And by the way, it's coming from the bank that isn't the principal. And so the bank, and by the way, it might be against the law to provide good security in Manhattan to the gold, right? So it's a very fragile situation where you don't have any incentive to make the security of the gold network better, and you don't have any incentive to make the transaction processing better, and you have no incentive to spread the gold to the ends of the earth and put it in the North Pole 100 feet down, right? Because that's not the way it works. But I think with Bitcoin mining, what's really fascinating is we're now in a sprint from the year 2021 to 2035, where you have the most entrepreneurial corporations in the world, and anybody in any jurisdiction can go after that $18 billion a year. And it's a mad rush to get the data center, to get the hardware, but to find the energy. And if you actually pick a jurisdiction, pick Bonzo land. If I go to Bonzo land and I set up a Bitcoin mine and then the politicians make it illegal, well, mining leaves Bonzo land, right? And so the mining is going to find the most supportive political environment. And if I go to Yo-Yo land and it costs 10 cents a kilowatt hour, you're getting squeezed out in Yo-Yo land. And if I can't get the hardware, that doesn't work. But if I can't get the hardware, but I have a lot of money, I'm going to go build my own chip. So what I see, which I just think is just absolutely brilliant, is the mining industry for Bitcoin is on about a 24-year aggressive bootstrap to decentralize itself, to find free energy, to find friendly jurisdictions. There's a massive amount of money to be paid, right? Like if you're in yo-yo land and you actually make Bitcoin mining 10% taxed, you lose all the revenue and it goes to, happy land. And so the Bitcoin mining problem is going to, and the Bitcoin mining industry is going to decentralize a set of very specialized technology nodes in a place with a very favorable political jurisdiction with favorable energy economics. And it's going to go to the four corners of the earth. And keep in mind, people in Manhattan have all the money, right? So all the money's in Manhattan. There's no incentive for someone in Ireland or the North Pole or the middle of sub-Saharan Africa to provide transaction processing and security for people who are rich in Manhattan with the gold standard or even with the fiat standard. It's not, no one anywhere else in the world is going to do something to help someone in Manhattan under the fiat or the gold standard. Under the Bitcoin standard, it is truly the most free, open, competitive market for security and for transaction processing. And the part that's expensive, which is finding the Bitcoin, well, it's only expensive in the first generation of Bitcoin when it needs to be because the holders have a vested interest in double subsidizing the miners to make that work. And then when you get out in the year 2035, 2040, all of a sudden you've got $100 trillion of monetary energy on the Bitcoin network. That's probably going to be 20 basis points, even 10 basis points, because the transaction fees will probably go with the log, as opposed to linearly. You're not going to have to pay 100 times as much to process a transaction that's 100 times as much money. You'll pay 10% more or 20% more. So what we're building toward is a network that could very well secure $100 trillion and do it with a 10 basis point a year fee. And it will be secure because it got radically decentralized in the first 30 years. And it got radically specialized. You're going to have 89th generation SHA 256 or SHA whatever. And I know there's other ways we'll get more specialized too. And the miners get there, there's no cliff where all of a sudden the block subsidy goes away. And so they're going to get weaned off of that gradually. And even in the 4 years after the next halving, when they're slightly unprofitable, they'll have all the sunk cost and all the other hardware. So you've got this natural dynamic to turn the miners into holders, into hodlers, and then to create this three-legged stool of the people with the Bitcoin, the ones with the technology, and the ones with the energy. All of them are working together to stabilize this entire network ferociously as fast as they can. And it highlights the decentralized nature of the network, which is truly a thing of beauty. I use the phrase, Bitcoin's a swarm of cyber hornets growing stronger behind a wall of encrypted energy. And I think that my little soliloquy about mining, it illustrates what's going on there, which is there's just a very profitable wall of encrypted energy that anybody can throw up anywhere in the world. And if their execution leaves something to be desired, they get squeezed out. If they get behind in the technology, they get squeezed out. If the politics don't support them, they get squeezed out. If they run out of energy, they get squeezed out. But the swarm continues because it's just so decentralized.
Yeah, that was a fantastic explanation, Michael. Thank you very much for that. I think it might also be a great point now just to talk a little bit about the development of Bitcoin. So we're talking a little bit about the technology of Bitcoin. What does it mean that Bitcoin is, so Jimmy, what does it mean that Bitcoin is open source and how is it developed?
Open source means that the code is all out there for anyone to examine and fork. If they wanted to copy it and create their own Bitcoin, they could. And in fact, many have. Open source also means that development is done out in the open. So there's no sort of like secret code that's being inserted at any one time or anything like that, which closed source software does all the time. For example, if Google changes its terms of service on a particular piece of software, it's usually because there's something underneath the hood that they might be changing up and so on. But open source means that it's all open for anyone to see. And you can go right now to github.com/Bitcoin/Bitcoin and look at the software and read the C++ code and Python code that's all in there. As far as your other question about how Bitcoin development happens, it's done through a typical open source collaboration. So at any time, anyone can submit what's called a pull request or changes to the software. And anyone has the right to do that. If you're a coder, you can submit a pull request at any time. What is necessary in order to actually make it into the software is for a lot of people to review it for any critical mistakes or anything like that. Make sure that it works, that it does what we want it to, and from an economic and even philosophical point of view, why you have to essentially justify why this change should be in the software. Now, if you can't do that, and if even a few people disagree with you, then it's not going to get in the software. Generally, it is done by consensus, where a bunch of people review the code, and then it gets merged into the code only if there are no outstanding objections that haven't been addressed or something like that. So that's how it works. Some pull requests take years to get through. I know Carl Johan Alm, for example, maintained Signet for a couple of years before it actually merged in. There's I think Sjoerd Provost has worked on the hardware wallet interface for years before it got merged in, and so on. So it's not necessarily a quick road, and unlike software at other places, it's not move fast and break things. And if you break anything in Bitcoin, there are some serious financial consequences. So as a result, everything is done very carefully, very slowly, very conservatively. And that's how we have the Bitcoin software we have today.
Thank you, Jimmy. And Michael, if you've got any comments to add just around Bitcoin development and the technology around it and your view of that, if you've got anything you'd like to add.
I think it's an extraordinary example of probably one of the best successes, if not the best success, of open source development in our lifetime. And you couldn't have said that after 1 or 2 years, but I think that after 12 years, I think you look back at it, and shake your head and wonder. It's pretty extraordinary. As a large hodler, I would say my general views towards software is measure twice, cut once, move forward thoughtfully, carefully, and I think there's two types of mentality, right? You've got the engineers that want to add bells and whistles as fast as they can because they think that features make their product successful. And they tend to have sexy products, but oftentimes they collapse under their own weight because either of attack surfaces or instability, or what you find is a long tail of features, and you add the 11th feature and it's appealing to 0.01% of the people. So I think that that's one idea. And then there's the other idea, which is just less is more. And what's the simplest possible thing you can build that will meet the requirement of the market? I think that Bitcoin's already there, right? Bitcoin could be a $10 trillion or $100 trillion network based on what it has. So you kind of have to weigh things on the side of don't break it more than improve it. And I think that to a certain extent, there's a lot of things that people want that if they're not built into the core protocol, they'll probably get built into the layer twos, either Lightning, or they'll be built into, you could look at it as, I wish Bitcoin was better, faster, more functional. Or you could look at it as, because Bitcoin isn't faster and more functional, that's a business opportunity for someone. Look, I mean, love them or hate them, Binance and Coinbase have businesses worth $100 billion because Bitcoin isn't a good DeFi trading network thing, right? So fine, Square will have their business opportunity. They added the ability to move Bitcoin to a Square cash tag instantly for no fee. Okay, to the extent that that no one else does it as quickly, then it's an opportunity. And Square's got $100 billion market cap, which means the Square can go raise $10 billion if they want, and they could hire 10,000 engineers to work on that. And if it made economic sense, then they would do it. The one thing that Bitcoin must provide to be successful is integrity and trust. That is, I mean, call it trust, integrity. Maybe you could add security, right? At the end of the day, you don't really need to add more functionality. They're nice to have, but the free market being the free market, if there's not enough privacy in it, someone's going to come up with a layer 2 privacy solution. And if there isn't enough speed in it, someone will come up with that. And if there isn't enough simplicity, if they want a simpler interface, someone's going to come up with that. And so rather than getting obsessed over driving a lot of new functionality into Bitcoin, I think the right thing to say is, what do we have to do to the protocol to keep it from becoming obsolete or less secure? And there are legitimate things like that. But otherwise, let the Squares and the PayPals and the Googles and the Binances and the Coinbases and every venture capitalist and every other crypto, let them all obsess over the seeming functional deficiencies of Bitcoin, and they can go and they can build their thing that plugs into it. Because I think that if you look out, what seems clear to me is that we're going to have a world with 8 billion people with a mobile device, and you're going to have 100,000 Bitcoin banks, and Binance is a Bitcoin bank, and Coinbase is a Bitcoin bank, and Square is a Bitcoin bank, and anybody that takes a Bitcoin address, even PayPal's a Bitcoin bank, they all have some kind of underlying Bitcoin asset layer, and they're using the protocol for settlement. So the world and the marketplace is much more complicated, not just technically complicated, politically complicated. Like, in Nigeria, it's probably legal for someone to do certain things, but not other things. And many of the things that we're doing in the US probably aren't legal to do in Venezuela, or maybe might not be legal to do and pick a jurisdiction. So the type of bank that is compliant politically, and the type of bank that is compliant, that has the right technical capability, that's going to change every single month in every single place in the world so fast that it's going to take a planet full of people. It's going to take hundreds of thousands of companies and millions of people to try to keep up with that. You can't centrally solve it. So I think that the real principle for development is humility. Humility and open protocol and integrity and security. We're providing people something which is going to store the monetary energy of the world and move it on occasion. We don't have to move it fast. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you want to move 1 billion transactions a day, those banks will do it. And then you can imagine Square settling with Strike, settling with PayPal, settling with Binance once every 24 hours with a single thing on the blockchain. And maybe settling with somebody that spins up a bank in some country that didn't exist 2 years ago, that all of a sudden exists 24 months from now. When that happens, you're just going to want the underlying protocol to be trustworthy and to be rock solid. And I think we just, what is the word? Leave something for everybody else to do, right? Like, it's okay for 100,000 Bitcoin banks to launch in cyberspace and have a profit motive, and they can all code what they want. And it's okay for some of them you remember that if you want brittleness in the system, you try to keep any bank from failing. But isn't it current? It's a principle of Austrian economics. You should let the bad banks fail. And the equivalent in cyberspace for Bitcoin is, if the bank is a software application that's doing lightning payments, on channels between, 97 million people with beautiful functionality, and retina scanners, some of them are going to fail, right? It's like, you ever have a bad mobile app? We should let people take risks and innovate fast. And then we should make sure that we protect the integrity of Bitcoin and let them plug in. And if they're successful, maybe they'll be the next Snapchat or TikTok or Facebook or whatever. And for every one Instagram, there's going to be like 18,000 Instagram wannabes, and they all failed. And they all, but and the secret to Instagram was not the features they had, it was the features they didn't put in the system. And so maybe it'll be that these banks, all the software engineers that have the great, brilliant ideas about this new feature that everybody needs, maybe they'll be the ones that build the thing that fails because people didn't really need that feature. Or maybe that was just one genetic mutation too many, and it turns you into a creature that can't survive in the jungle because you reach too far. So I think humility, security, trust, integrity, and yeah, there's some things we got to do in Bitcoin Core to stay compliant with the latest generation of hardware or some network protocol, or else we become the dinosaur. But you figure out what you got to do. You do it very thoughtfully, very carefully with consensus. And if we all know that we're going to become obsolete if we don't do that, you won't have a hard time getting consensus. And then when you have that split and what you want to do, let Jack Dorsey take his best shot at it, and let Jack Mallers take his best shot at it. And let's see what CZ does, and let's see what, FTX does. And, and the market will sort it out. And the winner won't be the best engineer. It may not even be the most deserving, right? And maybe someone will have the best product in the world, and some politician will just take it from them. It's like those National Geographic, movies where they show like the strongest, best animal in the jungle that through no fault of its own had like a rock dropped on its head, and then the lion eats it. You're like, well, that's not the one that's supposed to die. That's nature, right? Sometimes it's unfair. And so you want to survive for the long run. We're back to the core principle: decentralization and robustness, and create a very, very natural competition amongst all of the software developers in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and have off-chain development as well as on-chain development, and let most of the genetic mutation take place off-chain. Because like if I actually get my stuff done using the Square Cash application and it works 1,000,000 times faster, and I can only do it in the US, well, that's good for 98% of the people in the US, and they'll do that. And then when someone in Africa can't do it that way because of compliance, then that creates an opportunity for somebody else to create their own business. And or the person that made all the money doing the thing in the US may very well take billions of dollars of the money they made doing it in a compliant way in the US and do it in an open source way on a Lightning protocol, in a stateless fashion somewhere else. And just, bottom line is, you shouldn't overthink these things.
Great. So I guess to summarize that, then we can think of it like Bitcoin Core is intentionally being very careful and very considerate of the vision of the project. And so while the code is open source, anyone can contribute to it. In terms of what actually gets into Bitcoin Core, there are very high standards, obviously. And so things don't just get in willy-nilly, right? And as Michael was pointing out, we can have the more faster innovation happening at other layers above that. So Bitcoin at a protocol level is sort of like the base bedrock that we're all relying on, that there are 21 million and certain limits and certain controls that we rightly want in place. And then above that, people can build other software that interacts with Bitcoin, or you can build a business that interacts with Bitcoin. And then we can think of it like if you are a retail individual, you may not necessarily interact with Bitcoin on the base layer yourself. You may be using some other higher layered service or some business. But of course, the aim is to keep it accessible also. So, over time that anybody can run a Bitcoin full node. So I think we're coming to the end of our time today. So probably a good spot to wrap up. But I suppose, listeners, if you haven't already, make sure you are following Jimmy. Jimmy, do you want to just tell the listeners where they can find you online?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Jimmy Song. I am also on Medium at Jimmy Song. I have a weekly newsletter that goes over a lot of the technical happenings in Bitcoin, jimmysong.substack.com. And yeah, my website is programmingbitcoin.com. That website comes from this book, Programming Bitcoin. It's published by O'Reilly. It is a technical treatise on Bitcoin. It'll help you learn the entire Bitcoin protocol, as we've been talking about. I have a couple of other books as well, the Little Bitcoin book and Thank God for Bitcoin, which you can also find on that website.
Yeah. And so for those of you new to Bitcoin, make sure you follow Jimmy. He's a very highly respected Bitcoin educator in the Bitcoin space. And he's obviously very technically gifted and able to teach people and he's trained many other people to themselves become Bitcoin developers and contributors. So listeners, make sure you check Jimmy out and go follow him. So I suppose that's probably bringing us to the close for this session. But of course, go to saylor.org. You can find the Bitcoin course there and you can sign up, and it's all free material and you can learn at your own pace. Michael, if you've got anything, I guess you want to close out with.
Thanks for being with us today. And we appreciate your support. Keep up the good work, everybody.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us this week. Again, thank you, Stephan. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're actually going to have the final unit of Bitcoin in 2 weeks, this same day of the week, same time. The time zones will be in the course. If you go through the course, we have it there. We have it on Twitter. We have it in the comments. So thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you.